The Wyoming sun sank like a furnace across the barren land, burning the horizon until the sky itself seemed to smolder. The prairie stretched wide and unforgiving, its grasses yellowed and brittle, breaking underfoot with a sound like snapping bone. Overhead, the pale blue dome of sky was empty, the light so harsh it turned dust and heat into a wavering mirage. Jacob Thornton stood on the porch, one roughened hand shading his eyes as he looked out. Behind him, the weathered cabin leaned with age, worn thin like the lines etched across his face. It had been 3 years since Martha, his wife, died from a fever that came swift and cruel. Since then, the place had known nothing but silence, save for the wind howling through cracks in the wood and the low cries of animals left too long without water. The barn had grown hollow. What cattle remained showed ribs sharp as fence posts. The well was near dry, each pull of the bucket yielding no more than a handful of muddy drops. Even the chicken coop, once noisy, was reduced to an occasional lonely cluck. Jacob kept at it, but he knew plain as day, one man alone could not fight the weight of frontier land forever. In his hand he held an envelope, sealed that very morning. Its message was simple, stripped bare of sentiment. He had written to a matchmaking agency in St. Louis, asking for a wife. Not beauty, not youth, not romance. Only a woman steady of hand, willing to endure hardship, willing to stand beside him in silence if nothing more. In return, he promised shelter, enough food to keep hunger at bay, and fair treatment. A bargain struck for survival, not a declaration of love. It had taken weeks for him to put pen to paper. Folks in Willow Creek, 15 miles off, had grown used to calling him the Hermit Thornton. Men at the saloon laughed into their mugs. Women shook their heads and whispered. Out here, a man without a wife was seen as half a man, and one who sought a bride by letter was thought even smaller. Jacob knew it all. He had heard the chuckles, felt the eyes on him each time he bought flour or nails from the general store. He had learned to ignore them, but deep down he knew the truth. He could not last alone. Not because of their gossip, but because a body had limits. Evening fell, throwing a red blaze across the prairie. Jacob's shadow stretched long and thin across the dust. He gripped the envelope tighter and let out a weary breath, a prayer carried to no one in particular. All he asked was for someone ordinary, not a beauty, not a storm. The prairie wind whipped harder, filling the porch with grit. Jacob closed his eyes against it, and for a moment he felt himself no more than a speck, fighting against nature's endless fury. The house shuddered under the gusts, the chimney swayed, the door groaned on its hinges. The only thing still holding firm was the stubborn will inside him. That, and nothing else. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly under the last light of day. The table stood in its corner, holding nothing but a bowl of cold beans and a slice of cornbread gone stiff. Jacob sat down, eyes lingering on the empty chair across from him. Martha's chair. Once it scraped across the floor, once it carried her voice telling him to eat a little more, to keep warm. Now it was a hollow place that mocked him with its silence. He chewed without tasting. His eyes kept sliding back to the letter. Such a small thing, yet heavy enough to shift the course of his life. He had never put stock in fate, but solitude had its own way of forcing a man's hand. Rising, he lit a candle. The flame threw his shape long across the wall, bent and distorted until it looked like another man altogether. Jacob pressed hot wax along the fold of the envelope, sealing it shut. As the wax hardened, so did his resolve. Tomorrow he would ride into Willow Creek and drop the letter into the post. After that, his life might turn down a road he couldn't yet imagine. He sat again, his eyes returning to that empty chair. Pain stirred, sharp and familiar. For an instant, he pictured a new figure there. Not Martha, but some other woman, eating beside him in silence. The thought chilled him, and he pushed it away. Hope was something he had buried long ago. Outside, the wind roared harder, rattling shutters, sweeping dust under the doorframe. The candle flickered, light breaking and reforming in unsteady rhythm. And Jacob Thornton sat with his sealed letter and the empty chair before him. The house held no laughter, only the sound of wind and the slow, heavy beat of a man's heart. One who had lost nearly everything, clutching tight to the last thread of survival. Tomorrow, things would change. Which way, he did not know. But one truth had settled deep in him. He would not walk the road alone forever. Tuesday morning broke sharp and bright, the sun cutting across Willow Creek like a blade of fire. Dust rolled thick over the main street every time a wagon passed. By the time the train was due, half the town had left their chores and crowded around the new depot, a plain wooden building, its roof shingles still carrying the scent of pine tar. Word had traveled quicker than smoke. The hermit Jacob Thornton was fetching himself a bride through the post. From the station window, Jacob felt the weight of eyes pressing on him. Nods, whispers, muffled laughter, hands raised to lips. 3 years he had grown used to standing apart in this very town that once called him neighbor. But today the stares were sharper, tinged not with pity, but with anticipation, as though the town had gathered for a spectacle. He wore a white shirt pressed smooth, a dark coat still holding the shadow of Martha's funeral, and boots polished to a shine that looked strange against the dust. In his chest, there was no thrill, only fear and a deep unease. This crowd hadn't come to welcome, but to watch. The whistle shrieked, long and mournful, drowning out the low buzz of voices. Black smoke curled through the air as iron wheels screeched against rail. The train thundered into the station, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Doors swung open, spilling travelers, a family herding children, a merchant clutching heavy cases, men with the restless look of those chasing land and chance. Jacob searched among them for the image he had carried in his mind. A woman hardened by sun, perhaps thin, perhaps plain. A companion built for endurance, nothing more. But when a gloved hand gripped the doorframe and a figure stepped down, the picture shattered. The woman was younger than he had dared to expect. Her skin glowed bronze in the light, her hair pinned neatly beneath a modest travel hat. A gray dress, simple but well-fitted, clung to the soft lines of her figure. And her eyes, dark, proud, carrying the weariness of distance, swept over the platform as though searching for ground firm enough to stand upon. The crowd fell into a hush, the kind of silence that prickled. Then it broke. Lord above, she's beautiful. No sense in it. How could he land a woman like that? There must be some trick behind it. Each word cut Jacob raw. He had begged for ordinary, for someone unseen. Instead, fate had handed him a woman who drew every gaze, stirring the whole town into a murmur. Emma Foster. That was the name she offered when she stepped closer, her full lips shaping the words with quiet certainty. Are you Mr. Thornton? His nod felt stiff. His throat had gone dry. He reached for the small wooden trunk in her hand, but at that same moment, Her hand lifted too. Their fingers brushed. Heat flashed like a spark, startling him back, while she stilled, eyes flickering. For a breath, their gazes locked. His, stripped of feeling for too long. Hers, a mixture of defiance and hidden sorrow. They both turned quickly aside, but something had passed between them, something neither had asked for. Behind them, whispers sharpened. No chance. A face like hers, marrying by letter? She's running from something, mark my words. Emma heard it. Jacob could see she did, yet her face held steady. Her chin rose, eyes set forward, every inch of her posture a shield against the judgment she walked through. Jacob's chest tightened at the sight. He knew those stares well. He had felt them often enough himself. But for her, here, carrying both womanhood and skin that set her apart, the weight was doubled. "My wagon's this way," Jacob said, his voice sounding too thin in his own ears. He took the trunk again. This time, she let go without hesitation. They stepped down from the platform, the crowd shifting to follow with their eyes. Emma's walk was measured, unhurried, but each step carried a gravity that turned heads. The hem of her dress brushed the dirt, collecting dust as she moved. Jacob kept pace, catching the curl of Mrs. Henderson's lips, the sneers of the Garrison brothers. And yet, more than their scorn, he noticed the set of Emma's shoulders in the sun, her chin lifted in a quiet defiance. At the wagon, he offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed her smaller one in his. Again that warmth, again the jolt. He helped her up, withdrawing quickly once she was seated, as if he had broken some unspoken rule. She folded her hands in her lap, silent. The crowd did not disperse. They watched as Jacob climbed to the driver's bench, gathered the reins, and clicked the team forward. The horses surged, wheels rattled, dust rising in their wake. Behind, Mrs. Henderson's voice rang clear enough for all to hear. "A beauty like that brings nothing but trouble. Trouble for him and trouble for this town." Jacob's grip on the reins whitened his knuckles. He gave no answer, never looked back. But he knew. From the moment Emma Foster had stepped onto Wyoming soil, his life would not remain as it had been. On the jolting seat, only a hand's width lay between them, yet it might as well have been a canyon. Emma tugged her hat brim low, shading her eyes. Jacob stole glances when he thought she wouldn't see, then turned away at once. The wagon rolled on, steady and relentless, carrying them away from Willow Creek, leaving behind the whispers that still chased them in the wind. The road from Willow Creek to the ranch stretched out like it would never end. Wagon wheels groaned against the dry ground, lifting clouds of red dust that stung the air. Prairie wind cut sharp across their faces, carrying the scorched scent of cracked earth. Jacob sat stiff, eyes fixed ahead, his hands gripping the reins so hard the knuckles showed white. Beside him, Emma kept her back straight, hands clasped tightly on her lap, head bowed just enough for her hat brim to hide her face. They spoke little. The silence waited, broken only by the jingling of harness bells and the creak of leather. Each jolt of the wagon swayed them closer. Once her shoulder brushed his. Jacob stilled, rigid as iron, and she righted herself at once. Both pretended nothing had passed between them. When the outline of the ranch rose at the horizon, Jacob's chest sank heavy. The cabin stood alone against the wide land, its boards weathered gray and tilting. The porch sagged. The barn leaned tired to one side. The patch of yard before the house was nothing but split earth. 3 years of solitude had stripped the place bare. The wagon stopped at the porch. Emma stepped down, her gaze sweeping slowly across what lay before her. She did not sigh, did not frown, did not shake her head. Only looked, quiet and measured, taking in the sagging roof, the dry well, the thin chickens scratching listlessly at the dust. Jacob braced for complaint, for disappointment. Instead, he met silence, steady as stone. Her lack of judgment startled him more than words ever could. He carried her trunk inside. The wooden door groaned on its hinges, opening to a space cold and still. Everything was in its place, tidy but stripped of warmth. A table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the main room, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. Useful things, nothing soft. Emma walked slowly, pausing at the stove, the cupboard, the dusty window. She said nothing, yet her eyes held the quiet endurance of someone who had long ago learned not to expect comfort. Jacob saw it plain. Whatever weight she bore, it was heavier than an empty cabin. By evening, Jacob lit the stove and set out supper: cornbread, beans, and a scrap of dried meat. He placed the bowls, then sat opposite her. Their first meal together passed in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. The table between them was narrow, but the distance felt unbridgeable. Each time their eyes lifted by chance, both turned down again. Jacob's heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He thought those parts of him had died with Martha. Yet Emma, with her quiet presence and unhidden beauty, unsettled him in ways he could not name, and that frightened him. When the meal was done, Jacob set his spoon aside. His voice came rough, breaking the silence. "We should be clear. This isn't a marriage for feelings. I need someone to share the work, to keep the ranch alive through winter. That's all." The words landed, heavy, final. He waited for anger, for hurt, for protest. Emma did not flinch. She raised her eyes, dark and steady, cutting as steel under silk. Yet behind the hardness flickered something faint, a trace of sorrow, small but sharp, like a crack in stone. "I understand," she said quietly. Her tone was even, but each word dropped in his chest like a stone in water. He thought he would feel relief drawing the line so plain. Instead, something hollow opened in him, as if he had severed a thing he hadn't yet dared hope for. Night fell. Jacob prepared the small side room for her, once Martha's sewing space. He lit a candle, set it on the table, and stood back. Emma stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the bare bed, the narrow desk, the lone drawer. She nodded once. No complaint, no sign of displeasure. Her silence once again left Jacob unsettled. He returned to his own room. On the wall still hung Martha's old coat, limp with dust. Jacob sat at the edge of the bed, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks, the fire snapping low in the stove outside. For the first time in 3 years, he was not alone under that roof. Yet the feeling was not ease. It was unease, pressing tight in his chest. In the next room, Emma sat on the narrow bed's edge. She pulled off her gloves, set them on the table, and clasped her hands tight in her lap. Her gaze fixed on the wall, her lips pressed firm. No one could read her thoughts, but her rigid posture, the way her fingers curled, spoke of a will wound tight. She was telling herself to endure. So they remained, 2 strangers under one roof, each behind their own door, each listening to the same restless wind and the groaning of old wood. For Jacob, the silence was no longer wholly his. A cold house, yes, but from that night forward, it no longer belonged to him alone. The sun that week bore down harsher than it had all summer. Day after day, the sky held no cloud, only a dome of hard blue pressing heat into the ground until it cracked wide. The cattle, already thin, now showed ribs like fence slats. Each morning Jacob rose before the light, walked to the pens, and found another beast fallen in the dust. He dug shallow graves with aching arms, sweat darkening the earth that swallowed them. Every death carved a piece out of him, as though the ranch itself was bleeding away. Emma often stood a few paces back, watching in silence. She didn't ask questions, didn't complain. When the digging was done, she stepped forward, took a spare shovel, and pressed dirt over the carcass without a word. Her hands, untried when she arrived, roughened quickly, but her eyes never wavered. Jacob noticed, and though he never said it, a strange stirring grew in him, part admiration, part unease, part something else he dared not name. That afternoon, the sun poured into the yard like molten fire. Jacob hauled 2 buckets of the last water from the cistern toward the horse trough. Emma insisted on carrying one. She lifted it carefully, stepping slow across the uneven ground. Then her foot caught on a stone. Her body pitched forward. In that instant, Jacob lunged, his arm circling her waist, holding her firm. Their bodies pressed close. Sweat, dust, and heat tangled in the narrow space between them. Emma lifted her face, dark eyes startled wide. Jacob felt her heartbeat quick and strong, echoing his own. For one sharp second, the world stilled. Then he let go, stepping back as though burned. "Careful," he muttered, voice low, rough in his throat. Emma straightened her dress, reached for the bucket spilled on its side. She nodded, lips tight, yet at the corner of her mouth a flicker trembled, as though a word of thanks had risen but stayed behind her teeth. The moment passed, short as a breath, but it left Jacob restless. He had promised himself this union would be survival, nothing more. And yet, the brush of her body had set his resolve to trembling. Night brought cooler air but heavier silence. Jacob sat inside, ledger open, trying to tally what stock remained. His eyes, though, kept straying to the door. Moonlight spilled across the prairie, turning dust to silver. Through the window he saw Emma on the porch, seated alone on a wooden chair. She rested her hands on her knees, gaze lifted toward the vast sky. Her hair, loosened at last, spilled down her shoulders, catching moonlight like a dark river edged in silver. Her face, so often proud and guarded, now carried a shadowed sadness, deep and unspoken. She looked carved from strength, yet softened by a sorrow he could not reach. Jacob stayed in the dark, afraid to break the spell. Something in that stillness felt sacred, as though the house itself held its breath. He realized then that the woman on his porch was more than a bargain struck in ink. She was a soul tempered by battles of her own, carrying strength and scars alike into the life they now shared. His chest tightened, not with grief, not with toil, but with a feeling he thought long buried. It frightened him more than hunger, more than drought. He turned away, yet the image etched itself deep. Emma in moonlight, proud, weary, and unknowingly fragile. It marked him like a scar. Later, lying on his bed, he turned restless. The wind moaned through the cracks. The fire snapped low in the stove. But the sound that haunted him was not the wind. It was the echo of his own heartbeat, hammering wild in the moment his arm had held her steady. A cold house, a land that refused mercy. Two strangers bound by necessity. And yet, piece by piece, in fleeting touches and wordless moments, they had begun to brush against each other. Not through vows, not through promises, but through the quiet collisions no one could prevent. The sun clung to the land like a curse. Each day it blazed down on the prairie, spreading cracks across the soil until they looked like scars carved by some giant hand. Around the cattle pen, Jacob moved heavy-footed, his eyes falling on the weakest calves. Their eyes had gone glassy, their breathing shallow from thirst. He stroked the neck of one, felt the rasp of its breath, and a hollow despair clenched at his chest. That night, over bowls of thin beans at the table, Emma lifted her head. Her voice was calm, but it cut through the silence. "We have to dig a new well." The spoon slipped from Jacob's hand, clattering against the tin. He shook his head, voice dry as dust. "There's no water here. I've lived on this land 8 years. If there was any, I'd have found it." Emma didn't argue. She met his eyes and waited, steady and patient, as though she had already expected that answer. Then, quietly but firmly, she said, "Look at the cottonwoods. They're still standing. Their roots are drinking from something beneath us. We try once. If we're wrong, we lose nothing but sweat. But if we're right—" She stopped, but the flicker of hope in her eyes spoke the rest. Jacob stared at her, something in him shifting. It had been a long time since he'd seen anyone believe in this land. At last he nodded, a reluctant surrender to the fire in her gaze. The next morning they chose a spot near the ragged cottonwoods. Jacob gripped the shovel, sweat already beading on his skin, though the sun had barely risen. Emma stood beside him, her hands clenched, then bent to take up the spare pick. "This is hard work," Jacob muttered. "You don't need—" Emma cut him off, her pick striking the earth with a sharp crack. "We're partners, aren't we?" So they dug, shovel and pick, back and forth, hour after hour. Dust rose around them, clinging to their skin and hair. They traded places, one breaking ground, the other hauling earth. The hours stretched, each minute weighted like an hour, each foot of earth harder than the last. By midday, Jacob's palms had split, blood seeping into the wood of the handle. He gritted his teeth and kept swinging. Emma saw it. She stepped close, touched his wrist to still him. "Give me your hand." He hesitated, then opened his palm. The skin was torn, raw. Without a word, she tore a strip from the hem of her dress, the fabric fraying in her fingers. She bound the wound with quiet care, her movements gentle but sure. For a moment, the distance between them vanished. Jacob's eyes lingered on her face, sun-darkened, dust-streaked, yet unyielding. A line of sweat traced her jaw, glinting in the light. Emma lifted her eyes, meeting his. They held there, silent, longer than either meant to. Jacob looked away first, afraid of what might slip through if he didn't. By evening, the hole was 10 feet deep and bone dry. Jacob dropped to the dirt, chest heaving. "It's useless," he rasped. "We're digging our own graves." Emma stood above, her dress soaked through with sweat, her back straight despite it. Her voice did not falter. "Just a little deeper. Only a little more." The sun bled red across the horizon. Then Emma's pick struck darker soil. A damp spray burst upward, speckling her face. She gasped, swung again. This time water seeped, slow but certain, into the hole. "Jacob!" she cried, her laughter tangled in her breath. He leapt down beside her, shoveling earth aside. The wet spread, pooling in their hands. They scooped it up, muddy and thin, pressing it to their faces, their lips. It tasted of grit, of salt, but it was life itself. Jacob dropped back, shoulders against the dirt wall, Emma collapsing beside him. Their arms brushed, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and relief. For the first time they both laughed, raw, unguarded. The sound carried across the barren land, defying the silence that had reigned so long. In that moment, bitterness and walls between them crumbled. They were simply two souls who had bled into the earth together, waited on a miracle and been answered. Jacob glanced at the strip of her dress wrapped around his hand, then at the fire still shining through her fatigue. Something stirred in him, something he thought had been buried with Martha. Trust, and more than trust, a fragile seed of faith. That night, the new well trickled into the waiting bucket. The sound of water, faint and steady, rang in Jacob's mind like music. Emma paused on the porch before retreating to her room. She tilted her face to the star-crowded sky and whispered, as if only to herself, "Sometimes all it takes is digging just a little deeper to find what matters." Jacob heard from the shadows. He did not answer, only stood there in silence, letting her words carve into him. Words he knew he would carry from that night forward. That afternoon, the sky changed its face. It darkened like cloth stretched taut, gray and heavy, the wind tearing across the porch with a shrill edge. Jacob sat inside mending a bridle when thunder split the air, rattling the windows in their frames. He froze, listening. A drop struck the glass, then another. Each ran down the pane in thin, trembling lines. Emma stepped out from the kitchen, a cloth still in her hands. She stopped at the window, eyes fixed on those first fragile streaks. Then, as if the heavens themselves had broken open, rain came, hard, heavy, drumming on the roof and pouring over the thirsty prairie. "Jacob, it's raining." Her voice shook, caught between awe and disbelief. Before he could speak, she pushed through the doorway, running out into the storm. Her dress clung to her at once, soaked through. She lifted her face to the sky, arms spread wide, turning in circles beneath the roar of thunder and the sharp scent of wet earth. Her laughter rang out, clear, unguarded, shattering the long silence that had lived in that house. Jacob stood at the threshold, his heart hammering. She was no longer just the woman who had come by letter, not merely a partner in work. In that moment, she was wild, alive, blazing against the storm, stirring something long dead inside him. "Emma!" He rushed out, caught her arm, his voice rough, trembling. "You'll catch your death out here." She only laughed, water streaking her face, her eyes bright as black fire. "After all these months of dust and thirst, don't you want to feel it?" He pulled her in close, her body cold with rain yet burning against his chest. Their eyes met, and every word, every bargain, every wall between them crumbled. He bent his head. The kiss struck sudden, fierce like the storm itself. Emma stiffened, then yielded, answering him with the same hunger he had fought to bury. They clung to each other as though both had been wandering too long and had at last found harbor. Jacob drew her inside, both dripping, breath ragged. They stumbled just beyond the doorway, lips meeting again, desperate and unrestrained. Firelight flared from the hearth, casting them in gold as fabric slipped loose, falling from shoulders. That night, the distance dissolved. No longer survival, no longer strangers bound by need. They gave to each other not just flesh, but trust, the frailty they had hidden, the gentleness they had feared to show. In Jacob's arms, Emma was no longer the woman sent by post. She was flesh and spirit, alive with breath and heartbeat, her hands clutching him as if he might vanish. And Jacob, at last, stopped running from the weight inside him. He whispered her name between kisses, not as duty, but as truth. Outside, the storm raged on, rain drumming its wild hymn on the roof. It was a song for them alone. Later, when the fire quieted and their bodies lay still, the room glowed with warmth while rain softened to a steady hush. Emma lay against him, hair damp across the pillow. Jacob held her close, his arm firm around her waist. She lifted her face, voice no more than a breath. Jacob. His name on her lips was prayer, was vow. He closed his eyes, pressing her nearer, letting his heart tremble awake for the first time in years. From this night onward, nothing would ever be the same. The rain had fallen without pause all night, and by morning the land steamed with mist, soft tendrils curling off the damp soil. The prairie smelled alive again, fresh earth, faint green, and the faint tang of wet wood. The ranch, though still battered, seemed to breathe. Grass shimmered pale with new color, and the cattle lifted their heads with a weary hope. But inside the cabin, another storm churned, silent, close, no less fierce than thunder. Emma sat near the hearth, firelight flickering across her face, weary after a night with little rest. Jacob stood at the window, arms crossed, shoulders tense. Between them lay a gulf not of distance, but of what had changed. The barrier once held in place by duty and silence had been broken. Nothing would return to what it was before. Jacob, Emma began, her voice husky. Her fingers knotted together in her lap as if bracing herself. There's something you need to know. He turned, eyes fixed on her. Emma, you don't have to. I do. Her words cut firm. You deserve to know why I came here, why I left Missouri. She drew in a long breath. The story spilled out, slow at first, then with the weight of years behind it. Her father had been a gambler, a man who chased cards and dice with more passion than he ever gave to his family. She grew up with the sound of slammed doors, coins scattering, and rage spilling into every corner of their house. By the time she was grown, his debts had swelled into tens of thousands, money he could never repay. And then came Charles Whitman, wealthy merchant, his smile polite, his voice smooth, but behind it a steel colder than winter. He had offered a bargain, her hand in marriage in exchange for her father's freedom from debt. A contract written in ink but signed with chains. He didn't want a wife, Emma whispered, her gaze fixed on the flames. He wanted a trophy, something to parade. I heard him say it myself, telling his friends I was the finest mare in 3 counties, that he would break me the way a man breaks a wild horse. Her hand trembled, clutching at her skirt. I ran the night before the wedding, took what little I had hidden away and fled west. I answered the notices of men looking for wives, but all they saw was what Whitman had seen, something to claim, to own. Until your letter. You wanted someone plain, someone without beauty, without trouble. For the first time I thought I might be safe. Jacob stilled, her words cutting deep. He remembered the night he wrote that letter, his plea for simplicity, for someone who would not stir his grief or his neighbor's gossip. At the time, it had been cowardice disguised as practicality. Now, hearing her, he saw how cruel it had been, as if he too had been searching not for a person, but for an object, just one that drew less notice. Emma, his voice broke. He moved to her, kneeling before the chair. I was selfish. I thought only of myself, of hiding inside a quiet life. I forgot. No woman is a thing to be chosen for convenience. Not you. Not anyone. She lifted her eyes then, brimming with tears. Jacob raised his hand, rough and scarred, and laid it gently against her cheek. Her skin quivered under his touch, warm and alive. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he said, each word steady as iron. No man will ever treat you like a possession. Not Wittmann, not me, not anyone. This is your home now. You belong to no one but yourself. He pressed his lips to her brow first, slow and reverent, sealing the promise not in passion, but in respect. Then he kissed her mouth, tender, careful, as if engraving a vow. Emma closed her eyes, letting the tears slip free. In his arms, she felt something she had not known before, not desire, not possession, but recognition. For the first time, she was seen not as a prize, but as a soul. Jacob held her close, whispering against her hair. Let me carry it now. You've carried enough. Outside, the storm had passed. Only a few drops still fell from the porch roof, tapping into the mud below. But inside the cabin, something new had taken root. Trust, fragile but real. And with it, the first shaping of a love born not from survival, but from the choice to honor and protect. The morning dawned clear. The prairie washed fresh after the storm. Damp earth steamed in the rising sun, and the smell of rain still clung to the air. Jacob tightened a saddle in the yard, readying the wagon for the usual trip to town. Salt, nails, maybe cloth for Emma to sew. She asked to come. Her voice was steady when she said she couldn't keep hiding from the world's gaze. In her eyes, Jacob saw pride, but also the weight behind it. He gave a slow nod. The wagon wheels squelched in the soft earth, rolling toward Willow Creek. From a distance, the town looked like a dark smudge on the wide horizon. As they entered the main street, Jacob felt something shift. Conversations dimmed, laughter stilled, faces turned. Henderson, hefting a sack of flour, stopped mid-lift, staring. His wife pulled their daughter close, her eyes sharp with judgment. Jacob's grip tightened on the reins. The air thickened, heavy as storm clouds before lightning. And then he saw him. Charles Wittmann. The man stood before the saloon, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat cut fine, boots polished to a mirror shine. A sleek black stallion waited at the post, a beast fed on grain and luxury, so unlike the lean stock of working ranchers. Wittmann drew on a cigar, let the smoke curl from his lips, then smiled, cold, calculated. Thornton, he called, his voice smooth yet weighted with command. I believe you're holding something that doesn't belong to you. Beside Jacob, Emma stiffened, her body rigid as a bowstring. Jacob laid a hand lightly against her back, a silent anchor. He stepped down from the wagon, his eyes dark. She's my wife. She doesn't belong to anyone but herself. The crowd pressed closer, whispers sharpening. Whitman reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He lifted it high so all could see. A debt note, stamped and signed. "This," he announced, voice carrying, "is a lawful contract. Her father owes me $20,000. In payment, he signed her hand to me in marriage. This agreement stands, which makes Emma Foster my property." A ripple ran through the street. "God above. Is it true?" someone muttered. "She ran from him?" another hissed. Eyes shifted. Curiosity turned to condemnation, to suspicion. Emma stood frozen, cut apart by unseen blades of gossip. Jacob felt her trembling, and something in him broke. For years he had swallowed scorn, bent beneath whispers, lived quiet to avoid notice. But not today. Not with her. He stepped forward, planting himself before her. His voice rang out, deeper, sharper than his own. "She is no one's property, not her father's, not yours. If any man dares call her a thing to be owned, he'll answer to me first." The town held its breath. Emma lifted her gaze, tears brimming, but light blazing inside them. For the first time, Jacob was no longer a weary hermit. He was a wall no one could breach. Whitman's smile thinned, eyes narrowing. "You think your bravado rewrites the law? I hold the paper. I hold the right. What do you have, Thornton? A dying ranch? A handful of bones you call cattle? And your pride?" Jacob didn't answer at once. He reached back instead, his hand finding Emma's. Her fingers shook, then steadied in his grip, their palms locking tight. He turned back to Whitman. "You may have paper," he said, slow, each word heavy. "But I have Emma, and no law written by men like you will take her from me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, quiet approval. Others frowned, wary of siding against money and power. But Jacob no longer cared. In that instant, he had cast his lot. Emma's tears slipped free, yet a small smile tugged at her lips. For the first time in her life, a man had not claimed her as prize or property. He had stood, open, defiant, for her as a person. Whitman exhaled smoke, his gaze sweeping the onlookers. "So be it," he said, voice dropping to a growl. "If you want a fight, you'll have it. I'm not leaving. I'll take back what's mine, in front of every one of them." He tucked the paper back into his coat and turned, his boots striking the boardwalk with measured force as he strode toward the hotel. The echo of his steps fell like hammers. The crowd broke apart, but their eyes lingered, sharp and heavy on Emma until she felt near crushed. Jacob squeezed her hand once more, drew her closer, his voice low, meant for her alone. "You won't face him alone again. From here on, he faces us both." She pressed her face against his shoulder, breath unsteady. No words came. She didn't need them. The tremor in her chest told him all. High noon and Willow Creek burned like a great coal furnace. The main street lay silent and dusty when Whitman stepped out of the hotel, a tall shadow swallowing the town. He drew on his cigar, his cold eyes sweeping the crowd that watched his every step. Jacob and Emma had just stopped the wagon before the general store when Whitman spoke. "Thornton," he called, his voice laced with mockery. "I give you 3 choices." Jacob turned slowly, his gaze steady. "Either you hand Emma over to me. She is my lawful property." Whitman held the debt paper high. The town stirred again. "Or you cede this ranch, lands, stock, everything. I will leave you to live in shame." He paused. Then he smiled, voice dropping like a blade. "Or we settle this like men. A gunfight, at high noon, right here on this street. The winner takes all." A murmur rose. The onlookers exchanged looks, part dread, part relish. Willow Creek had not seen a life-or-death duel in a long while. Jacob tightened his grip on the saddle. Emma went pale, fingers clutching his arm until they shook. "Jacob, do not," she pleaded. Whitman exhaled smoke and smiled with cruelty. "You already know which choice you will make, Thornton. Do not play the hero. You are a tired farmer, nothing more." The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Jacob stepped forward one pace, his voice low but ringing. "I choose the third way." Silence fell like a stone. Emma screamed, clinging to his sleeve. "No, Jacob, do not!" Tears tracked down her face, her dark eyes full of despair. "He will kill you." Jacob bent and pressed his rough hand to her cheek, wiping away the tear. His look was resolute despite the weight on his heart. "I will not let him touch you. I will not let him take anything that is ours." Emma shook her head violently, her voice breaking. "If you die, I will have nothing left to live for." Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Whitman laughed, savoring the moment. "Tomorrow, at noon, on this very street. Do not come if you lack courage, Thornton. But I expect you will come. Love makes men foolish." He turned on his heel and walked away amid stunned stares, leaving a suffocating emptiness behind. That night, the ranch was heavy with silence. The insects on the porch, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wood. Each sound only sharpened the weight inside the house. Emma sat by the bed, eyes swollen from crying. Jacob unstrapped his pistol and laid it on the table, then moved closer. "You have to trust me," he whispered. She sobbed, smashing her hand against his chest. "Trust in what? Trust that tomorrow I will watch you bleed in the street? Trust that I will lose everything again?" Jacob held her tight and let the grief tear through him. He knew he might not return. To back down would mean handing Emma to a beast, surrendering their very souls. They lay down and clung to each other in the dark. Emma trembled and whispered into his ear, "If you die, I will have nothing left to live for." Jacob squeezed her to his chest, his breath heavy. He could find no promise strong enough to erase the fear in her eyes. Only one certainty remained. He would walk into the fight, however slim the chance. Outside, the wind cut through the grass like a summons. In one another's arms, they listened to the beating of their hearts, a strained rhythm that sounded like a warning of the bloody storm to come. High noon in Willow Creek came beneath a sky too clear, too still. No cloud, no breeze, only sunlight beating down on Main Street like a burning whip. The street, once empty, was now packed tight. From the store porches to the church steps, from rickety wooden balconies to rooftops, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The town hummed with hunger, part fear, part thrill. Jacob brought Emma down from the wagon. She wore a plain gray-blue dress, her face hollowed by a sleepless night. His hand rested on her back, steadying, shielding. Together they walked in silence, his boots striking slow against the hard boards. Whitman was already waiting at the far end. Clad head to toe in black, he stood like death itself, a silver revolver flashing as he spun it in his hand, lips curled in mockery. "Thornton, His voice carried sharp through the crowd. "Last chance. Give me Emma, or give me the ranch. Do not turn this street into your grave." Jacob gave no answer. He stepped into the center, his eyes fixed on the man in black. Sheriff Morrison, heavy-faced, walked forward holding a white kerchief. "The rules are plain," he said slowly. "When I drop this, you draw. The one who falls, loses. Fire early, cheat in any way, and you'll face my deputy's bullets instead." A wave of nods rolled through the crowd. The whispers died. All that remained was the thudding of hearts. Jacob drew a breath, his calloused hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver. He was no hired gun, no legend, but he held something Whitman would never grasp: a reason to fight, a life worth guarding. Behind the wall of onlookers, Emma clutched her skirt, lips trembling, eyes fixed on the man she loved. Her prayer was silent, desperate. "Lord, keep him with me." The sheriff raised the kerchief. Time froze. No sound but the crowd's held breath. The kerchief dropped. Whitman struck first, swift as lightning. His pistol flared, barrel aimed at Jacob's chest. But Jacob moved. He shifted sideways, the same instinct he'd used to dodge a charging bull in his ranching days. The bullet screamed past his ear. In that heartbeat, Jacob's hand went to his holster, not fast, but certain. He pulled, steadied, and fired. The blast cracked across Main Street. Dust flew. Whitman staggered. His face twisted. His pistol fell, blood blooming across his right shoulder. He sank to one knee, spitting curses through clenched teeth. The street erupted. Some roared in triumph. Others gasped in shock. No one had believed that Jacob Thornton, quiet, half-forgotten rancher, could best a man who bragged of 7 kills. Jacob held his gun steady, eyes cold. He had the right to finish it. His hand trembled. Then, slowly, he slid the pistol back into its holster. "I do not need death to prove I am right." His voice rang down the street. "A true man does not claim a woman's life by killing for her." Sheriff Morrison strode forward, signaling his deputies to seize Whitman, who writhed and cursed in pain. Jacob turned, found Emma's face in the crowd. He drew her to him, his voice unshaken though his eyes still burned. "This town must know. Emma and I were wed this morning. Reverend Collins witnessed it. The papers are signed, the bond sealed. No debt, no claim, no man alive has right to her." A stir swept the crowd, different this time. Reverend Collins stepped out onto the church balcony, raising the certificate high. "It is true," he declared. "Before God and the law, they are husband and wife." Tears streamed down Emma's cheeks. Jacob pressed a kiss to her brow. Gentle, solemn, a vow. Whitman howled, "No, she is mine. She belongs to me." His rage was drowned by the crowd's jeers and the iron grip of the deputies dragging him away. Sheriff barked an order. The outlaw was hauled down the street, but not before he spat his warning. "Thornton, it is not over. I have the law, I have money, I have men. You will pay." Jacob gave no reply. He only drew Emma close, shielding her with his body against the blaze of eyes. To the town, he was no longer a recluse in the hills, but the man who had stood, defied power, and claimed love on his own terms. Main Street had become more than a killing ground. In that noon light, it became a birthplace of courage, of choice, of a love stronger than chains. When Whitman was led out of Willow Creek, the clatter of hooves fading in a cloud of dust, the whole town seemed to shed a weight too long carried. Silence lingered until it broke into sighs, nods, and quiet talk, returning to the street. Yet Emma stood rooted, her hand locked in Jacob's, her heart pounding as if it might tear itself free. Jacob bent close, his voice low and steady in her ear. "He's gone. From this day, you're free." The words cut clean through the dark net that had held her captive. Emma lifted her gaze, tears shining but fierce, and for the first time she believed she was no longer bound. In the days that followed, the ranch stirred with new life. The fresh dug well brimmed with clear water, reflecting the sky like a rare mirror in this dry land. After a hard rain, green shoots pushed up across the prairie, a quiet promise of harvest. Jacob and Emma worked side by side, their hands rough and dirt-streaked, but their eyes carried hope. Calves stumbled to their feet in the pasture, bleating as they tested their legs. Jacob often leaned on the fence to watch them, then turned to see Emma tying back her hair, a small smile caught in the sunlight. In those moments he knew it was not only the ranch being renewed, but himself in town. Whispers around Emma began to shift. Once every step she took was shadowed by suspicion or scorn. But after the gunfight, after Jacob had stood before all and claimed her as his wife, the current changed. One morning at market, she bought flour and thread. Mrs. Henderson, who once pulled her daughter aside to avoid Emma, paused. Her eyes were cautious, but she gave a nod of greeting. A small gesture, yet for Emma it marked a turning. Another day, when a child tripped and spilled a basket of apples, Emma knelt, gathering each one, brushing away the dust before handing them back. The mother, who had often whispered in judgment, met Emma's eyes and gave a quiet thank you. Emma smiled, and warmth bloomed in her chest. Stories spread, no longer of a runaway asset, but of a woman who had stood fast beside Jacob Thornton, endured, and never fled. In time, people began to call her something new, not just that black woman with Jacob, but Mrs. Thornton. One afternoon, she and Jacob came to town for seed. The street bustled with wagons, horses, and voices. As they stepped down, eyes turned their way. Jacob reached out, suddenly, deliberately, and took Emma's hand. It was the first time he had done so openly. His grip was firm, weathered, and unshakable. Emma froze, her heart hammering. Memories flashed, ridicule, sidelong stares, the sting of contempt. Yet here, with his hand wrapped over hers, those gazes held no power. The crowd murmured, but none laughed. Some nodded. A few smiled. In the heart of the market, Emma realized Jacob had spoken louder than words. She was his wife, his equal, beyond insult or claim. She lifted her eyes to him. His look softened, a rare smile, tugging at his lips. In that instant, she knew she no longer stood alone before the court of others. Seasons turned. Willow Creek itself seemed to shift. Fields of barley rippled gold in the wind. Church bells marked the harvest. And market days grew lively with less of the old sharpness. Jacob often watched with quiet pride as Emma stood chatting with women who once turned their backs. The path to acceptance was not finished, but far had been traveled, and Emma no longer bowed her head. One evening, they sat on the porch as the sun sank red beyond the ridges. Jacob spoke softly. "See it? This land's alive again, and so are we." Emma leaned into him, her smile faint but sure. The sky deepened purple, the first stars flickered out. She whispered, "For the first time in my life, I feel I belong somewhere. Jacob tightened his hand over hers. He did not speak, for there was nothing more to add. Wittmann was not gone for good, and shadows still lurked beyond tomorrow. Yet Jacob knew one truth. Together they had carved a place for love, in the land and in the hearts of those who once denied them. And that was the truest victory of all. The first winter in Willow Creek laid a white shroud across the prairie, yet Jacob and Emma's small cabin glowed with warmth. Smoke curled steady from the chimney, rising into the snow-filled sky, while inside the fire snapped and crackled, blending with the sound of laughter. Jacob set a heavy log onto the flames, then lowered himself into the chair opposite. His eyes lingered on Emma. She was hanging a simple curtain she had sewn from coarse cloth, and when the sunlight broke through, it painted soft stripes of gold across the wooden floor. A small change, but to Jacob it turned a cold shelter into a true home. "You've made this place beautiful," he said, his rough voice carrying an uncharacteristic note of gentleness. Emma's dark eyes gleamed. "A home needs a woman's touch, but more than that, it needs the laughter of two people." She was right. Since Wittmann had been driven out, their days had grown lighter. The ranch had found breath again. The well still brimmed with clear water, and a new season waited. Jacob worked the garden he had abandoned after Martha's death. This time it was more than rows of vegetables. He planted flowers, too. He said blossoms reminded them that even the harshest soil could bloom again. One morning, with snow thick on the path westward, Jacob led Emma to the small graveyard. He carried white chrysanthemums. She held lavender she had tended in their yard. They stopped before the stone of Martha Thornton. The name was weathered, the ground silent beneath the frost. Jacob stood long in stillness, his face carved with new lines. Emma knelt, laying the lavender gently, brushing snow away with trembling fingers. "Hello, sister," she whispered, her voice catching. "I could never replace you, but I promise to care for Jacob, to never let him be alone again." Jacob closed his eyes, breath misting in the cold. He set a hand on Emma's shoulder. Thanks, agreement, and peace. In that moment, among graves and winter, they both knew love was not about erasing the past, but carrying it forward together. In the days after, their home became a symbol of renewal. At the table, no empty chair lingered, only two souls facing one another, trading glances and laughter. At the window, Emma's curtains swayed in the draft, while beyond, Jacob's flowers reached through the snow. One evening they sat on the porch, breath pluming in the chill. Jacob draped a heavy coat across her shoulders, drawing her close. "Cold?" he asked. "No," she smiled, resting against his chest. "This is the warmest place in the world." Snow blanketed the roof, muffling the prairie. In the quiet, only the sound of their hearts remained. Jacob's arms closed around her. Emma closed her eyes, peace curling across her lips. On the porch wall, a new board was nailed, its letters carved rough but firm. "Love chosen, not forced, can weather any storm." They had not found what once they thought they wanted. Jacob had not received a wife plain, quiet, without trouble. Emma had not gained a wealthy husband to carry her into comfort. Instead, they had found what they truly needed: a home, an embrace, and faith enough to last. Amid the winds of a harsh winter, their cabin shone like a beacon. Inside lived two people who had chosen each other, not by fate but by courage of the heart. Perhaps Jacob and Emma's tale closes here, but its echo lingers. A man who once walled himself behind grief, a woman once bartered as property. At last they found one another, not by chance, not by chains, but by choice. In this unforgiving prairie, they built a home where warmth and laughter stood in place of loneliness and sorrow. And on the board outside their door, the words carved in wood endure. Love chosen, not forced, can weather any storm. Dear friends, if this story stirs a memory, a thought, or a hope in you about love and belonging, we invite you to share it in the comments. Press like if it touched your heart, and subscribe to journey with us through more Wild West love stories, tales simple and warm, yet leaving echoes that last. Tell us, dear ones, what do you believe truly keeps two people together until life's end?